In the summer of 1945, a Soviet intelligence officer named Grigori Tokaev sat in a commandeered German farmhouse outside Berlin and read a captured document that made him set down his coffee and stare at the wall. The document was a transcript of conversations recorded inside an American prisoner of war processing facility near Frankfurt. The recordings had been obtained through a source Tokayev would never identify, not in the reports he filed to Moscow, not in the memoir he eventually wrote after defecting to Britain in 1947, not in the lectures he gave at Cranfield College of Aeronautics for the rest of his career. But the content of those recordings he described in careful, almost reluctant detail. Soviet officers who had fought alongside American forces during the final months of the war in Europe, men who had shaken hands with G.I.S. at the Elbe River in April of 1945, had said things about the American military that their political commissars would have found alarming. Not hostile things. That was the problem. They had said things that were genuinely, dangerously admiring. And admiration for Americans was, in Stalin's Soviet Union, a category of thought that could end a career, empty a family's apartment, or worse. What those Soviet officers said, recorded without their knowledge, and eventually pieced together through declassified archives in Washington, London, and after 1991 in Moscow itself, reveals something that Cold War propaganda on both sides buried for half a century. The men who knew the American military best, who had fought next to it, observed it, and competed with it across 3 continents, were privately more impressed than they ever admitted in public. This is the story of what they actually thought and why it terrified the system they served. The alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Second World War was one of the strangest partnerships in the history of warfare. 2 nations that viewed each other with ideological suspicion, that had almost no cultural common ground, that were separated by an ocean and a worldview, found themselves on the same side against a common enemy. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States shipped approximately 17.5 million tons of war material to the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease program. This included nearly 400,000 trucks, 13,000 combat aircraft, 7,000 tanks, and 1.5 million blankets. Soviet propagandists minimized this contribution. Stalin himself repeatedly downplayed American assistance in speeches designed for domestic consumption. In the official Soviet telling, the Great Patriotic War was won by Russian sacrifice alone, by the limitless endurance of the Soviet people and the tactical genius of Soviet commanders. American contributions were an embarrassing footnote, the work of capitalists who had waited until the tide was turning before sending material help. But the Soviet officers who actually used American equipment told a different story when they believed no one was listening. Colonel Vasily Krysov commanded a tank regiment equipped with Lend-Lease Sherman tanks during the fighting in Ukraine in 1944. He later wrote in memoirs published only after the Soviet collapse that the Sherman was not the best tank he had commanded in terms of firepower. The gun was adequate rather than exceptional. The armor was thin by Soviet standards. But the Sherman, Krysov noted with something approaching wonder, never broke down. The T-34, which Soviet propaganda celebrated as the finest tank in the world, suffered from transmission failures that experienced crews expected as a matter of course. New T-34 drivers were told informally that the transmission required a man's full strength to shift, that you had to hit the gear lever with your fist. The Sherman's transmission shifted with 2 fingers. Krysov described Soviet mechanics gathering around a damaged Sherman that American technicians had repaired at a forward depot, watching in silence as the engine started on the first attempt after what should have been a catastrophic breakdown. One of his sergeants, a veteran who had maintained T-34s since 1941, said nothing for a long moment and then asked quietly how many factories America had. He was not asking for an exact number. He was trying to understand a country that could build something this reliable in the hundreds of thousands. The question of American industrial capacity haunted Soviet military thinking throughout the war and into the Cold War that followed. Soviet planners were themselves obsessed with production. The movement of entire factory complexes east of the Urals in the winter of 1941, disassembling machine tools under German bombardment, and reassembling them in Siberia while workers lived in unheated barracks and died of cold and exhaustion represented an industrial achievement that staggers the imagination even now. The Soviet Union understood what it meant to produce weapons under desperate conditions. They had done it. They had done it at a cost in human suffering that no other nation in the war had paid. But what American industry had done was different in a way that Soviet officers found difficult to articulate without sounding like they were making propaganda for the enemy. American production had not been born from desperation. It had not required the evacuation of cities or the sacrifice of civilian consumption to zero. American factories had converted from automobiles to tanks without workers sleeping on the factory floor. American shipyards had built Liberty ships at a rate that eventually reached one every 10 days, using assembly methods adapted from the automotive industry, while civilian shipbuilding had barely paused. The Soviet Union had produced weapons by consuming its people. America had produced weapons by applying a system so efficient that it seemed from the outside almost inhuman in its ease. General Konstantin Rokossovsky, who commanded Soviet forces at Stalingrad and later led the drive toward Berlin, gave extensive interviews to Soviet military historians in the 1960s that were classified and not released until the 1990s. In those interviews, a copy of which was obtained by British historian Antony Beevor during his research for his book on Berlin, Rokossovsky described a visit he made to an American supply depot in France in late 1944, arranged as part of an Allied liaison mission. He walked past rows of vehicles that stretched beyond what he could see from where he stood. He asked his American escort how long it would take to resupply a division that had lost all its transport. The American officer checked a clipboard and said approximately 4 days. Rokossovsky said he did not respond immediately. He thought about what 4 days meant. In the Soviet system, replacing transport losses at that scale might take weeks. The men who were waiting for those vehicles would be fighting on foot or not fighting at all. 4 days meant something that he could not say aloud to his escort, could barely think in organized form, because the implications were too large to fit inside the framework of what he had believed about capitalist industrial organization. The American system of radio communication produced reactions from Soviet observers that bordered on professional jealousy. Soviet signals doctrine in the early years of the war had been catastrophic. Stalin's purges of the 1930s had devastated the officer corps, and signals officers had been among the hardest hit, partly because communications equipment required contact with foreign technology and foreign ideas, which made its operators automatically suspect. Soviet radio discipline was poor. Frequencies were often compromised. Commanders defaulted to telephone wire because they did not trust their radios, and telephone wire was cut by artillery within hours of being laid. The result was that Soviet units in 1941 and 1942 often fought in something approaching communications blindness, with corps commanders unaware of what was happening to their divisions and divisions unaware of what had happened to their neighboring regiments. The Germans had exploited this blindness ruthlessly in the early campaigns, driving through gaps in Soviet lines because no one on the Soviet side knew the gaps existed. By 1944, the Soviets had made enormous improvements. American Lend-Lease included signal equipment, and Soviet signals officers studied American methods with the attention that comes from having learned a lesson in blood. But what they observed when they accompanied American units in liaison roles was still, by their own private accounts, startling. Colonel Nikolai Antipenko, who served as a logistics officer with Soviet forces and later wrote memoirs that were heavily censored before publication, described watching American forward observers call in artillery fire during a joint exercise near the German border. Village ruins in background. The observer spoke into a radio the size of a small suitcase, and within what Antipenko timed at 3 minutes and 40 seconds, shells began falling on the designated target from guns that Antipenko had not been able to see from his position. He described asking his American counterpart how this was possible, how fire from guns miles away could be adjusted and directed so quickly by a single officer with a radio. The American explained the Fire Direction Center system, the centralized calculation of firing solutions, the FM radio links that cut through battlefield interference. Antipenko wrote that he listened carefully and asked several clarifying questions and then was quiet for the rest of the afternoon. In his memoir, he described this as one of the most educational afternoons of his military career, but the passage was struck from the published version by Soviet censors. It appeared only in the unredacted manuscript that his family preserved and that was eventually deposited with a Moscow historical archive after 1991. What Soviet generals most privately admired and most feared discussing openly was something that had no ideological explanation within the Marxist framework they were required to apply to all military analysis. The American army learned faster than any other army in the war. This was not supposed to be possible. Socialist theory held that a planned economy coordinated by the state should be able to allocate scientific and industrial resources more efficiently than a chaotic market system driven by profit. The Red Army had the full resources of a centrally planned state behind it. American forces were products of a society that the Soviet system officially regarded as disorganized, profit-driven, and riddled with class contradictions. Yet the American army, when it encountered a problem it could not solve, solved it faster than the Soviet army solved comparable problems. The hedgerow crisis in Normandy in the summer of 1944 was, to Soviet officers who learned of it through liaison reports, a vivid example of this capacity. American forces had been stalled in terrain that their doctrine and equipment had not been designed to handle. Within weeks, a sergeant had invented a device from scrap metal, a general had watched a demonstration and immediately ordered mass production, and the entire army had been re-equipped in under 2 weeks. Soviet doctrine would have addressed this problem through a top-down redesign process that moved from front command to Moscow, through committee review to factory modification, back to front command, and then to the units in the field. The timeline would have been measured in months, not days. The American timeline was not possible within the logic of how Soviet officers understood institutional change. And yet, it had happened. General Andrei Krylev, who served as chief of the Red Army's rear services and was responsible for Soviet logistics throughout the war, gave a series of lectures at the Frunze Military Academy in 1948 that were transcribed and filed as restricted documents. One copy of this transcription eventually made its way into a collection donated to the Russian State Military Archive by a retired officer's family in 2003. Krylev told his students, all of them senior officers who would shape Soviet military doctrine in the Cold War years, that the single most dangerous characteristic of the American military was not its tanks or its aircraft or its artillery, though all of these were formidable. The most dangerous characteristic, Krylev said, was what he called their system of correcting mistakes. In the Red Army, he noted with a candor that would have been unthinkable in a public forum, a commander who reported a failure upward risked being held personally responsible for that failure in ways that discouraged honest reporting. The result was that failures were often concealed, minimized, or attributed to the enemy's unexpected strength rather than to the commander's own errors. The system learned slowly because the system punished the transmission of accurate information about what had gone wrong. In the American Army, Krylev observed, failure appeared to generate reports, and those reports appeared to generate changes in training, doctrine, and equipment that were then pushed down to every unit in the theater within weeks. He had no explanation for why a capitalist army would be better at institutional learning than a socialist one. He simply noted that it was, and that Soviet military thinking needed to account for this in any future conflict. The most sensitive of all the Soviet assessments concerned American soldiers themselves. Soviet ideology held that American workers in uniform were fundamentally alienated from the capitalist war aims they were being asked to fight for. They were, in theory, wage earners manipulated by propaganda into serving the interests of Wall Street and the defense industry. They should have been poor fighters, poorly motivated, fighting without the ideological commitment that sustained Soviet soldiers through the nightmares of Stalingrad and the siege of Leningrad. The Soviet soldiers who actually encountered Americans at the Elbe did not find this theory confirmed. What they found instead confused them. American soldiers were clearly not driven by ideology in the Soviet sense. They did not speak of historical materialism or the triumph of the working class. They spoke of going home, of getting the job done, of not letting down the men next to them. They were, by Soviet standards, extraordinarily well-fed, well-equipped, and well-paid. They complained about things that Soviet soldiers had not complained about since before the war, things like mail being slow and rations being repetitive and leave being canceled. Soviet soldiers listening to these complaints found them, by their own later accounts, both bewildering and quietly upsetting. These men who had everything were still fighting. They had not been driven to the front by the NKVD. They had not been threatened with consequences for their families if they ran. They simply kept advancing, and when they took fire, they immediately called in artillery that arrived within minutes from guns that never seemed to run out of shells. Major Ivan Savinkov was a political officer attached to a Soviet liaison team that accompanied American forces during the crossing of the Rhine in March of 1945. His official report described American military efficiency in neutral, technically admiring language that avoided ideological awkwardness. His private diary, which his daughter found in a box of his belongings after his death in 1987 and eventually shared with a researcher at the Institute of Universal History in Moscow, said something different. Savinkov wrote that he had watched American soldiers cross the Rhine under fire, and he had tried to find the mechanism of their motivation, the thing that made them advance when they could have stopped, the belief that drove them forward. He could not find an ideology, he could not find fear of their officers, he could not find the kind of furious national desperation that he understood from his own experience. What he found, he wrote, was something harder to explain, something he kept coming back to in his diary entry, an entry that grew longer and more frustrated as the night wore on. He wrote that American soldiers appeared to be fighting for each other, that this seemed to be enough, and that he did not know what to make of a system that could produce this kind of loyalty without the apparatus of political education, ideological enforcement, or existential national threat. He concluded in the last line of that diary entry that this was either the most impressive or the most troubling thing he had seen in 4 years of war, and that he was not sure which. The Cold War buried these assessments under decades of official hostility. Soviet generals who had privately admired American methods returned to a system that required them to publicly dismiss those same methods as the corrupt product of capitalist militarism. American capacities that had impressed them were reframed as the temporary advantages of a nation that had not suffered real war on its own soil. The lessons that Krylev and Antipenko and Rokossovsky had drawn from their observations were filtered through an ideological lens that made honest analysis politically dangerous. Some of what they knew found its way into Soviet military doctrine anyway, smuggled in through technical language and institutional memory, because the officers who had actually seen American logistics and American communications and American maintenance systems understood that these things were real, regardless of what ideology said about them. The Soviet army that faced NATO across the Fulda Gap in the 1950s and 1960s was a different institution than the army that had nearly collapsed in 1941, and some part of what made it different was what its senior officers had learned by watching America fight a war. Grigori Tokaev, who defected to Britain in 1947 and spent the rest of his life working in British aviation research, gave a lecture at the Royal Aeronautical Society in London in 1956 in which he said something that the audience received in puzzled silence. He said that the most important military secret the Soviets were trying to steal from the West in the Cold War was not the hydrogen bomb or the jet engine or the guidance system for ballistic missiles. Those were important, he said. But the real secret, the one that could not be stolen because it was not a blueprint or a formula, but a way of organizing human institutions, was what he called the American capacity for correction. The ability to find out what was going wrong, tell the truth about it without destroying the people who delivered the truth, and change the system before the enemy could exploit the failure a second time. He had seen this at work in the war. He had watched it in the transcripts he read in that farmhouse outside Berlin in 1945. He had understood, even then, before he defected, before he spent decades in a country built on the principle that this capacity was not the product of capitalism or democracy or any specific ideology. It was the product of a culture that had decided, somewhere deep in its institutional foundations, that the organization mattered more than the comfort of the people running it, and that the truth, however painful, was always less dangerous than the lie told to avoid it. He sat in that farmhouse in the summer of 1945 and read Soviet officers describing American soldiers with an admiration they could not safely express, and he understood that the war that was just ending was not really the war that mattered. The war that mattered was the one being fought between two ways of organizing institutions, two ways of deciding whose voice gets heard when things go wrong. One side in that war had learned, in the fires of North Africa and Normandy and the Battle of the Bulge, that the answer was everyone who had something true to say. The other side was still trying to work out whether the truth was permitted. That contest, begun in the foxholes of France and the supply depots of Normandy and the radio nets that crackled above the Rhine, would define the next 50 years of human history. The Soviet officers who said admiring things about Americans when they thought no one was listening already knew which side would win. They just could not say so out loud.